Assumptions of criminality. Is that the examples he used in the beginning?
I think so.
Okay.
That was all the negative stuff, and he got to the positive after.
Kelly, can you come up a little bit closer, please? At least on the first two rows. Thank you very much.
Come on.
It's your Seminole State blue on.
Looking very presidential.
That means it's gonna be in the, okay. Oh, wait. Okay.
Well, here comes somebody else.
Oh, that's too late.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Gerald Jones, and I am today's host for the Black Minds Matter conversation at Seminole State College. Let me take this opportunity to welcome each of you who may be streaming at your locations at our Oviedo campus and at our Altamont Springs campus, and wherever you may be streaming this video today. This is week 6 of our sessions on Black Minds Matter. We're on our way to finishing the course at 10. And we're so excited for our president, Dr. Georgia Lawrence, for bringing this concept to our institution. And at this time, I also want to thank all of our colleagues who have been engaged and have taken this work very seriously week after week so that we can come back and bring our thoughts and what we've learned to help bridge the gap, not just move the needle, but bridge the gap in terms of graduating more black males here at Seminole State College. And hopefully we could serve as a model nationally for other colleges to begin to look at the great work that we're doing. Today's discussion is assumptions of criminality. And it was a very exciting video led, of course, by Dr. Luke Wood, as well as some of his colleagues and expertise in the field. For those of you who had the opportunity to watch the video, you know that we heard from Dr. Howard, Dr. Savage, and Dr. Nugara, who are very phenomenal researchers and experts in this field on criminality. They talked a lot in the video about K through 12 in terms of what that meant with the topic assumption of criminality. But for the purpose of our discussion, hopefully we can relate our answers to higher education, colleges and universities. And I'm sure we will dive back and forth into the K-12 as well. Our first question I want to start off with is, what are assumptions of criminality? And how do they affect the experiences of black boys and men?
You know, the video did mention a little bit with colleges. It mentioned that sometimes they're followed around on, in parking lots. They're followed around in the bookstores. That's an assumption of criminality. That sometimes professors will keep doors closed when they're presented with certain students. So that's a little bit that we can think about in our own everyday interactions with students.
Well, assuming to what was on the video is assuming a person of color is dangerous, criminal, defined based on race. So we have criminality.
I noticed it also even gave an example. I think a child was about 18 months old and they were at a bouncing type house environment, and it was just showing that even at such an early age, their behavior seemed more as menacing than even childlike. So it was showing how almost kind of a lot of students were saying that they had felt almost a surveillance type, attitude when it came to being in the presence of school, is that they're more so surveyed versus, them being in a welcoming environment.
One of the things that stood out to me, and Dr. Luke Wood mentioned early on in the video, is that black boys and men are often viewed as immoral or amoral, often viewed as up to no good regardless of the situation or the environment. And one of the situations that was brought to my attention recently was that of a social worker, a young man who is studying psychology in college, and he had the task of supervising a parent-child visitation. So the child had been removed from the parent's care, but the parent was entitled to visitation, supervised visitation, and this young man, a black male, was tasked with supervising the short time that they would have together, and they all agreed to go to something like an ice cream store or donut shop or somewhere to have something to eat. And the workers in the store called the owner, saying that they were concerned about him and his presence, didn't really know what he was doing there. And ultimately the owner called the police. The police came and asked him to leave. And he was there really just doing his job as a social worker, and really wasn't a threat, was not a threat to anyone at all. So again, this idea that just because of their appearance, black boys and men are often viewed as up to no good, regardless of the situation that they're in. And Dr. Savage, I believe it was, mentioned about, you know, even those who have the social capital that we say matters, advanced degrees, college education, good jobs, as it were, that even those folks are often viewed, and I know we have a couple in our group here today who have already shared some of those instances as up to no good.
Going back to the question Dr. Jones asked about the assumptions of criminality, I'm going to echo with my good colleague here sitting next to me, Karen Thompson. What are the assumptions of criminality? In fact, these are things that we address in sociology all the time. According to Dr. Wood, what I've seen in the video, the assumptions were, black boys and men are seen as were dangerous, up to no good, like Barbara talks about, and looking at these perspectives based on race. And I think Dr. Wood also, cautioned us about the 3D effect, which I think is very important throughout this course. We have to be careful, of viewing these black boys and men through the lens of the disdain and the distrust and the disregard. I think once we do that, and the main thing I think is just try to be careful with labeling and the stereotypes that we have, these implicit and unconscious biases that we have about these students, if we want them to do well. So I'm just echoing from Barbara and Dr. Jones and Carol about these assumptions. We just have to be very, very careful, these negative images that we see our students, especially in the schools or higher academic institutions.
I just want to remind those of you who are streaming with us today, if you have any comments, please send them to jonesg@seminolestate.edu, or any other questions you may have at your streaming locations, and we will answer them and dialogue with you. As I was watching the video, I just want to comment on this particular question before we move on in terms of assumptions of criminality. Dr. Wood started his video giving about 5 to 10 assumptions of criminality that that many black boys and men experience, especially in institutions of higher learning. And one is that college men of color being followed around the campus bookstore to make sure they don't steal anything. Where does that come from? Another one is one that I've heard numerous times, seeing a group of men of color and saying, and I want to abbreviate that, seeing a group of men of color or people of color and saying to them jokingly, "Oh, here comes trouble." I don't know if you all have experienced or heard that before, but you want to elaborate on that or have a comment behind that?
Well, for me particularly, actually, I mean, here at the institution, actually, there are some folks, but jokingly, they'll tell me when I approach them, here comes trouble. And sometimes I laughed. But after going through Dr. Wood and seeing what he's addressing in his video, I'm starting to question why are they actually saying that? You know, is a reason, or is it something hidden why they're saying here comes trouble? So I kind of question that. So now I'm taking the approach that if I approach you and you've said here comes trouble, you're going to tell me where is the trouble coming from. I want to know. I mean, really. So, but jokingly, I mean, I've experienced it here at the institution. And I think if people are listening, those people know who says it, and it's not gonna. I'm not gonna allow it anymore. So if you say that to Babuka is coming. Make sure you understand that those games are done. It's over, and we just all gonna be professional. And there's nobody coming here and then for trouble.
I've had where there's 2 or 3 people of color together, and I've had people approach and say, "Oh, there's trouble," you know, just because we're just together, talking work-related things, but the assumption of 2 or 3 people of color together, that there's problem and trouble. So I've experienced that here at Seminole State.
Mine isn't necessarily the here comes trouble, but I've definitely got hit with the little girl or you're a good girl. And sometimes, that makes me feel like either, I know I'm not a child, or, for instance, that I'm not mature enough to be an adult. But sometimes I do see it, almost as a little bit taking back that I am not seen as a woman, that I'm a good girl or a little girl. So.
Well, I have not experienced it, but I can understand how those kind of biases are all around. An issue of criminality, you have some individuals in society where if anything looks strange, they immediately think the worst, and they start creating, escalating the situation when there's no need. So there are some individuals in society that are paranoid, and I experienced that in my neighborhood, and it's not a racial component, let's say, but it can become a racial component very quickly, right? So from criminality, absolutely, is an issue of a bias, is paranoia, if you're not like me, then I'm already afraid, right? In terms of groups, it's interesting to hear this because it's kind of like, it's silly, right? It's just silly. People will congregate, and it's just silly to start thinking like that. So I'm kind of surprised about that people will think that way. I personally have experience from my own end. When I get together with some Latin American friends, we tend to be a little bit joyous and loud, and we definitely do stick out. And so, absolutely, I think there's an element of culture associated with that aspect of here comes trouble. Well, when they see us together, yeah, we could be trouble because we're a little loud and joyful and fun, right? And we're just different.
That brings to mind 2 things. And again, the assumptions of criminality. Unfortunately, I believe it was, again, Dr. Savage, who said the numbers don't lie. So when we look at the number of black males, for example, who are stopped by police for no apparent reason other than they are black, or who might be in a situation, but the response to them is much more aggressive than it would be towards other, we can only assume that, yes, there is some racial element here. What's interesting is that I can't speak for everyone, but I often police myself. When we talk about assumptions of criminality, even though I grew up in predominantly black cities, I assume when I go into certain areas or certain situations that I'm going to be looked upon a certain way. So for example, when I go into a store, a retail environment, I make sure that my bag, which is might be considered oversized by some, is closed. I make sure that I don't do anything that might be perceived as suspicious. And again, this is me who, even though folks don't know me, to look upon me, you would hopefully not assume that I'm there for criminal reasons, and yet that's my mindset because that's something that I've just grown up with, and it's something that I've had to tell my own children, right? And so as much as I would like to think that that's not necessary, I believe it still is for those very reasons. Otherwise, they get followed when they go into a store and they have a backpack on their back, even though they have a backpack because they just left school, so it's only natural to have a backpack. But yet, because they're in that environment, others may see it as them being up to no good. So it's interesting that I find that I often police myself because of what others might assume about me.
As we stay with this topic, as I was preparing this morning for today's conversation, 4 examples, modern day examples, came to mind that's relatable to higher ed. And they all centered around the phrase of mistaken identity. Do you remember in 2009 when Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Harvard University professor, was arrested at his Cambridge home because a neighbor called and reported a man breaking and entering the residence? And then in 2013, a West Virginia student spent 4 days behind bars for mistaken identity. And this year alone, 2018, I don't know if you remember, a Black Yale graduate student who took a nap in her dorms, a commonplace, and a white student called the police. And then in October, just last month, police draws gun on 2 Rowan University students after mistaken identity. So these assumptions of criminology and people who are in leadership or in authority may exhibit implicit biases, or whether it's unconscious or perhaps it is conscious, that it is something that needs to be addressed at institutions of higher learning, because it is happening at our colleges and universities, and that's why conversations like this helps us be on the winning edge and learning more about these assumptions and how they relate, and particularly to how we view black males. Let's move on now and talk about the classroom. And I want to ask the question, how does classroom management strategies adversely target black boys and men? Dr. Woods talked a lot about that in his video. So does anyone have any insight on that?
Well, one of the things that's mentioned in the video, well, some of the things that are mentioned in the video is that black students and black males in particular, similar to what I just said a few minutes ago about how the reaction is much more aggressive. And though that was a lot of the example, that was the context of a lot of the examples that Dr. Wood provided, is that the response to what is perceived as misbehaving by black boys is much more aggressive. Their parents are called, they're tossed out of the classroom, they're placed in detention, or they have some of their privileges revoked. And so, and again, and this was the very thing that Dr. Savage was referring to when he said the numbers don't lie. When we look at the numbers of school suspensions, black boys excuse me, and girls often have much higher percentages of school suspensions in comparison to their peers, and it does not reflect the true demographic of the school. In other words, 10% of the school population might be black, but those students represent 40, 50% of the school suspensions. It just doesn't make sense. So when we talk about classroom management, it goes to some of those strategies where professors don't assume the worst. And I want to just throw this in. You mentioned some recent examples. We just heard something about a week or so ago of a young lady who was in a classroom, a lecture hall, and the professor called the school security on her because she had her feet on the back of a chair while she was taking notes. And so again, something that seems very innocuous, but because of whatever the professor's perception was of that student's behavior, she apparently saw it as an affront and decided to call the school police instead of perhaps asking the student to remove her feet from the back of the chair or having a conference with that student afterwards.
When I look at this question, actually, I was asking myself, I said, I mean, really, do we have institutions that purposefully, have, classroom management strategies that adversely affect, any student? Doesn't matter black or white student. And I had to really think about it, carefully. And I wasn't sure if actually I could find any strategies, but maybe the unintended consequences that we faculty actually do cause sometimes. For example, I had a faculty member who observed an adjunct faculty, and according to the my faculty who observed this adjunct faculty, she told me that when she arrived in the classroom, there were 3 students that came late, and there were 2 white female students and a black male student, but the professor only addressed the black student, asking, why did you come to class late, in front of everybody? And the 2 female students, he did not address them. So, and then this actually faculty of mine, who is actually a white professor, was doing the evaluation and was very upset when she came to tell me what was going on. So I think those might be strategies that maybe the faculty might create that adversely affect the students that they serve. So that professor is not teaching here anymore because I thought that was wrong to do. He could have just maybe talked to all the students or the 3 students after class. Or asked the black student, why did you come to class late? But not to address him in front of everybody and leave the 2 female students. So professors like that, we shouldn't allow them to continue taking this course because, that's telling me as an administrator that you don't value or understand the narrative of the students. You don't understand why the student come late. You don't understand what he was doing. Just put him down like that in front of everybody. So that didn't work out well. So we have to be careful with those kind of stuff, especially our teachers in the classroom, teaching our kids.
And just how you're saying too, just with the management strategies in general, we're learning that the research is showing that it's not showing the student's experience, that there's strategies that are implemented that are from certain biases or past biases, that they're not from a child's perspective or a student's perspective that can actually help them excel. And I think what is very interesting is the fact that it's almost twofold. So you have those who may have biases, but it's not only just the student and say possibly a white teacher or a teacher of a different race. You have black teachers and you have black educators who also carry the same biases. And I think that's the part too, is where you say even seeing ourselves. You have the student where they said that almost like if they're reprimanded, every bad experience that they have had can come out in that moment. And it's almost to know as an educator that you have to know that you have to know that certain conversations, you don't know if they're triggers. You don't know if this is something that they experienced multiple times. And, they're fed up at this point. So I think it's very interesting to kind of see that the biases kind of, exist on both ends. So it's very important how they said to almost critique privately and praise publicly. I thought that was very interesting.
Well, I personally think that this kind of forum is excellent, right? Because overcoming this biases that are, perceptions or racial bridges, right? Data is very important, right? It's critical. Sometimes I feel like that all this analysis and data might divide us in terms of racially or ethnic-wise, but I think it's important to keep that avenue open and then discuss it openly so we can all learn and become better better human beings, right? Because we're always going to have that, we're different from one another. We'll have difficulty understanding one another because we all come from different backgrounds. And learning how to deal with that is important. And the only way that I can see that is through having this kind of continuity of diversity training and diversity discussions, because overnight, nothing's going to happen overnight, right? It's a journey, right? It's a journey in this multicultural country.
And one of the things that I think Dr. Wood brought out too was have a strategy that allows for a fresh start every day and treat each day as a new day. So that's an interesting way to kind of look at our classroom strategies and question whether our strategies allow for that, or are we building, on the week or on the month, or, are we having requirements that do not allow us to look at each day as a new day? So I thought that was a good one to really allow some reflection.
So what do we do for the faculty member who, we know who may be engaging in implicit biases, and how do we have that conversation without changing their curriculum or teaching style?
Well, Dr. Wood talks about it. Some of the strategies he mentioned, the racial consciousness. And I'm always going to defer to Barbara. We have the Faculty Institute. She's doing a very good job, I think. In fact, it's important maybe have the president invite Dr. Harris or even Dr. Wood to come to the institution and address these issues next spring. And going back to what Barbara said, looking at the data, I think it's important when we have this faculty dealing with these students. As administrators, we look at their evaluations. Maybe if the students are, feeling this kind of way negatively in their classroom, maybe, in fact, Dr. Wood talks about it, that the students normally know the teachers that treat them negatively. And if the students know, I'm quite sure they would put it in their evaluations. So the administrators have a chance to see, maybe those negative evaluations. Now, it's our duty to have a hard conversation with these professors, and hold them accountable, just like all of us are held accountable in this class. They have a duty to teach, not to devalue the students that we have in their classrooms. So, Dr. Jones, to answer the question, I think we have to really hold these professors accountable. And then, have this faculty training, about race issues, the diversity issues. And hopefully things will get better.
I also think that, we're talking about faculty in this, but also as someone who works on the student services side, we have to also bring those leads into the fold and make sure or hope that they are also trickling down the information they would learn with a session like this. I think we can make it more pointed to provide the video in shorter segments as a more concentrated training session for those individuals as well, to say when those students are coming into you for services, how are you seeing them? How are you perceiving them when they walk in the door? How are you greeting them? How is the conversation going? Even if the student is initially, it's a negative interaction with one person, just because that you see that, whether it be in comments or whatever, and you're supposed to be helping that student next, you don't just assume that that's the same interaction you're going to have. And so I talk to my staff quite a bit about treating them as an individual in that moment, and not worrying about, yes, you read comments to see what else has happened in the conversation, but you don't take on that tone, because your conversation with that student might be different. Your experience may change their whole experience, to where from them meeting you, it could be a totally different college experience for that student. So I think it's valuable to stretch this just beyond the faculty as well, and stretch it to all the leads. To piggyback off Shayla, when you say student services, it's amazing how in an institution of higher education, we very seldom take the phrase, the customer is always right. And when you say, and even when the students can still be wrong, we still have to re-engage ourselves to realize it's still a customer and it's a service that we're providing. So it's almost like if we took that tone with every student that we had, how you said the tones will not always be carried on so much with biases. If the customer is always right, then your goal is to get to a resolution as easily as much as possible that works out for both parties. And so I think that's one thing where you say changing the tone of things, regardless of, you know, the makeups of our students. If we're seeing that we're there to provide a service and we're expecting them to receive the content of this service, then we have to see them that. So.
Well, from a back to the strategy, I think a culture has to continuously be driven. A culture of inclusion. It's just got to be continuously driven from the top, and I see that in this setting here. I think that this is a very inclusive organization. And so it's got to continue. It's got to be driven. There's got to be training and open discussions and data exposure to drive that change in behavior or to continue that behavior of inclusion. So it's a culture, right?
And when I think back to times in my life when I've had maybe what you might call an epiphany or a realization, a lot of times it has come from the people who have been closest to me, something that a coworker that I work with every day has said to me, or a friend or something like that. So I think one of the main things, the question was, what can we do when we see colleagues who may have implicit biases, is to be ready ahead of time. And we talked before at a previous session about being ready when we hear someone we know make a strong racial comment and we think, oh, I'm shocked, you know, how do I deal with that? So I think it's similar here when we see even small things. Be a little bit prepared as to what we might be able to say. I know I've had, through this session, there are some things I've realized about myself that I've had some implicit biases, and now I'm thinking about those. So I think having conversations with coworkers saying, you know, I went to this series, I learned some of these things about myself. If you ever see me or hear or observe me doing this or that, tell me, and I'll do the same for you. I mean, they don't necessarily have to volunteer, but knowing that we're looking for the same thing back, I think makes a better it makes a relationship where we can be open with each other and we can have those conversations.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, some of the other practices that he mentioned are moralizing practices where actually, and I think it's important to have our curriculum, reflects some of their cultural aspects. I think it's important to bring in the classroom, because I think that would enhance dignity and uplift these black students. And also the other thing he talks about, rejecting deficits and fears of black minds in discussion. I think that's important. And all these things happen in the classroom. And I think, as faculty and teachers, dealing with the students, we just have to be careful. And I remember one of the sessions, Dr. Wood talks about, these kids that we teach, let's look at them as our own children. Not only our students. And if we love our kids, we should love the students that we teach. I think that's very important, having that positive image about the students that we teach when they come in the classroom.
I think one of the challenges when we see others who may treat black boys or men through a criminalized lens, I think one of the challenges is the relationship. And I know in previous sessions we've talked about the importance of relationships with students, the relationship, but also with our peers. And so, for example, if we have a classroom teacher or a professor who's mistreating a black student, if I say something, that professor may then think that I'm overly sensitive about this issue because I'm also black. So I think it's important to have other folks, allies, who also, when they see situations and things happening, who are willing to speak up and, as Turi said, be ready ahead of time. But also to, in that space, to be considerate, conscientious, to make good choices. And I say that having seen a situation in a store recently where a black couple was waiting in line and someone passed through, cutting the line to get to the other side of it, and then a white female loudly reprimanded the person who had cut through line, much to the embarrassment of the couple, who really didn't feel any way about it, but then this white female made a huge scene out of what probably was really nothing. So I think even in the speaking up, we have to be mindful.
One of the things that Dr. Wood kind of guided us in this particular video, as he did last week, is he talked about the Black Minds pedagogy for educators, and that has been alluded to throughout several of the answers or dialogue that we've had here today. I just want to briefly, for the purpose of those who are streaming with us, or for those of you who may not have had the opportunity to really get into the video, there were 5 that he gave. One was race consciousness, meaning being cognizant about race and racism at all times and how these factors influence individuals in the learning environment. Number 2 was memorializing practices, as Dr. Job mentioned, ensuring that the curriculum examples and discussions are culturally relevant while also proactively affirming the morality and inherent dignity of Black minds. The other was use non-confrontation tones. The language should employ, as Barbara just mentioned, should be calm, non-hostile, and respectful. The next one was allow for a fresh start. Meaning to treat each day as a new day, being willing to provide them with a fresh start as you would with others. And the final one, as someone mentioned, critique privately, praise publicly. I believe you said that. Provide critique of their performance and action in private lessons, praise publicly, pull students aside, speak with them after class, speak softly and at eye level. As we begin to wrap this particular conversation up, I just want each of us to spend some time now and talk about what was something new, interesting that you discovered through today's this conversation, or as you were watching the video. What were those new insights or that aha moment that you learned in this session?
Mine wasn't necessarily an aha. It was almost kind of like I didn't think about that could be a problem. And it was kind of interesting because I actually had an experience. When I was a career coordinator, I had a graduating senior, and she was very hesitant. She was a criminal justice major, I mean, great grades, but she just seemed so hesitant to, dive out into her market. And come to find out, she had a DUI that was on her record. And knowing her trying to be a probation officer, she was terrified of, the consequences. And so I think for me, the interesting part that came back to it was, even though we may not necessarily have programs specific to students who have been incarcerated before, I think it's more so when you say their openness of getting, whether it be your board to buy into it, where they were saying that your board has to be behind certain things like that, or getting students to push over that threshold, or them having issues with the industry, or as far as having opportunities in the market. So I think that for me was kind of an aha moment where it's like, okay, even though we may get them to this education part, are we still doing enough as far as trying to build a model or build a blueprint that's going to carry them into the job market ultimately.
And this is kind of similar. It's along the same lines. Multiple times, once during Dr. Savage's interview, she said, we need to do a better job of listening to our students, that we cannot make assumptions based on what we know through the research in the literature, but really finding out from a practical standpoint, what are the things we can implement to better support our students. So we have data, and data can be very good, but the data only tells us so much, so we cannot assume similarities across all populations or even across a single population based upon data without hearing the narrative behind the data and the narrative specific to our students here at Seminole State. And then I think the other, Dr. Howard mentioned that too. He said we need to talk to the students, get their stories, and talk to the young people, because they're the ones who are affected by it. So we may think back, well, I remember when I was in school, or I'm looking at this from a student services employee perspective or from a faculty perspective. What are our students' needs? And I think a lot of times that's where most of our faculty and staff believe in social justice. That's why we're here at Seminole State College. Yet there are things that we do sometimes in policies that we have, that we don't listen clearly to what the students are telling us about that experience, and then what we can do to make it better for them, so that we aren't actually putting barriers to their success.
One of the things that, excuse me, stood out to me, and I believe this was Dr. Howard who mentioned that in schools, particularly he was referring to K-12 schools, that anti-blackness coupled with anti-boyness often makes black boys public enemy number one. And so that stood out to me as something to be mindful of. But also Dr. Noguera, when they talk about what are some of the solutions, what can be done, and in recognizing that multiple strategies are required here, Dr. Noguera said, how do you rebuild support systems like an immune system that would protect young men, young black men and boys as they're coming up? So those were some of the things, you know, recognizing that has been said several times, this isn't something that's going to change overnight. But how do we restructure or rebuild the systems that will help support these young men as they work through? And if we truly believe that education is the way to freedom for a number of reasons, how do we have these students feel welcome in this environment, so that so that's one less burden that they have to deal with, and that gives them the opportunity to thrive?
I think my take on this, we just have to be careful how we frame our students. How we view our students, especially when they come to our classrooms. And going back to the pedagogy that Dr. Jones was talking about, the racial consciousness, one of them was to employ fair and consistent practices. I think it's important to look at, we're looking at these differences that our students have. Are they a function of their behavior, or is it about the unconscious biases that we have, the implicit biases that we have? And I think, you know, as staff and faculty in the institution, we just have to value all the students that attend this institution. We have to love them. And also, I agree with, I'm going to close up with what Dr. Tyrone Howard said, that we cannot be sympathetic destroyers of black boys and men. We have to be careful with that. Okay.
And in conclusion, as we wrap this particular session up, I would like to leave you with some of the things that Dr. Howard encouraged us forward with this work. And I thought that what he had to say was so profound as we attempt to attempt to bridge the gap. One of the things that he says, we must do this work with the right intentions for the right reasons. And that's self-explanatory. He also said, do it because this work is just and it is the right thing to do. And he also said, and I just really love this one, don't do it for notoriety. Don't do it because you want to expand your resume or you would like to get to the next place. Because you're going to find out, as he said, this role is not an easy one. This journey is not easy. This is hard work. This is hard, good work, meaningful work. And so for all of my colleagues who are here, and for those of you who are streaming, I would like to encourage you forward until we see change. And as long as we're committed to this, I believe that change is just around the corner. Thank you, and we'll see you for week 7 as we discuss campus climates and non-cognitive outcomes. Thank you.